Well, it indeed is a blessing to be invited to share with you here at Andover Newton, new home at Yale Divinity School. Ned, thank you for the invitation, and Mark, thank you for the gracious introduction. My title today, God's Living Letters, reflects a personal appropriation of our convocation's theme. In the beginning was the Word. Memoir as spiritual practice. And it echoes back to a text that first impressed me during the last year of my seminary studies in a course on pastoral ministry. And for each class of that course, we read a full chapter, and thank you students for reading the full chapter, of 2 Corinthians. It was taught by Carlisle Saylor. And Paul, in this letter, addressed the challenges of ministry in a conflicted situation. Maybe not unlike what we face today, with so much happening in our world. Paul reflects on the practice of needing letters of recommendation to validate ministry, not unlike an introduction to an address speaker, or what students may hope in the last year of their studies to have their profs write, or what may be needed in ministry change, or even a grant application, or a tenure review in a place like Yale Divinity School. Now, my address today on the theme of spiritual memoir is indebted to two persons. I don't know if second is present today. Is Willie Jennings here? No, not today. Okay. First, I want to thank my Wabash colleague, Willie Jennings, who directed a mid-career faculty colloquy, Mark suggested that, on the arts of teaching that inspired my exploration of memoirs while serving on the staff. Second, I want to thank someone who is present, Sarah Drummond, who suggested that I teach a course on spiritual autobiography. And some of you here were in that course in the past. I anticipated only a handful of students coming to the course and was surprised when 20 students enlisted to want to share how their life story connected with their faith stories that we heard about today. Well, back to our text. Paul remarkably refers to the believers in Corinth as letters written on hearts by the very Spirit of God. This is a remarkable claim. But ironically, while he himself is writing a letter, he contrasts the letter and the Spirit, noting in verse 6 that the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. I wonder, though, and this I would ask of the Apostle Paul, what would happen if both letter and Spirit worked together rather than to stand in conflict with each other? Clues are suggested to me when I compared Paul's reflections upon his own life journey. In other New Testament texts, namely Philippians 3, 4 through 6, and Acts 22, 3 through 5, Paul reflects upon his own life journey and what breaking from the past meant for him in relationship to his call to follow Jesus, much like Maurice came to seminary. And when I graduated from college, Maurice, my friends told me, "Bob, you should go to seminary." And guess what I said? No way. No way. 5 years later, that changed, and I was in seminary. Well, how does Paul describe his own journey? Circumcision on the 8th day, member of the people of Israel, member of the tribe of Judah, Hebrew born of Hebrews, related to the law of Pharisee, a persecutor of the church, blameless in relation to righteousness under the law. These are all viewed as loss on the ledger sheet of his life compared to what he gained in his faith. We might also add his academic pedigree, especially in a place like Yale. Being trained by Gamaliel in Jerusalem and noted explicitly in Acts 22 aspects of his defense before the Roman and Jewish authorities, this is what he says: "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel. Footnote: I find fascinating that Gamaliel is also noted in Acts 5, who as a Pharisee in the revered council, the whole group of Jewish elders, not unlike a faculty meeting, I imagine, defended Peter and the apostles and asked for discernment whether the teaching about Jesus as Messiah and his way was of God or of human origin alone. Paul goes on, educated strictly according to Jewish ancestral law, being zealous for God. This same Paul, then Saul, persecuted those following the way of Jesus, as supported by the high priest and the whole council of elders. Yet this Paul's life was transformed on the road to Damascus. I find it striking that Paul ignored the restraint recommended by his former teacher and mentor Gamaliel when he was prosecuting the followers of Jesus prior to his Damascus spiritual transformation. Students here, please note that teachers may have wisdom to share that make a difference in our life journeys, and we ignore them at our own peril. I myself ignored the wisdom of one of my professors that was followed up only 5 years later. From Paul's insights in 2 Corinthians 3, we can legitimately ask, how can we combine spirit and letter as meaning-making persons created in God's image? We can combine spirit and letter through our narratives, through the stories we tell and remember about our life journey. Christian revelation in Scripture is a narrative that spans from creation to consummation, anchored in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, as recounted in the 4 gospel accounts. Our life journeys are given meaning through the connections to the Christian narrative and or other faith narratives that guide our lives and ministries. With Jesus' life story disclosed in 4 Gospels rather than just one Gospel account, we realize the importance of multiple accounts. One was not sufficient, as I was reminded by a former student and friend, Patrick Jackson. Some of you may know Patrick. He is now a pastoral intern in Richmond, Virginia, who waited a whole year for placement. Well, he emailed me a link to a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie from July 2009. The title of Adichie's talk, a graduate of Yale, by the way, in African Studies, was The Danger of a Single Story. The Danger of a Single Story, which has global implications. By the way, my grandson, Oliver, 16, had remembered this TED Talk and was impressed by it. Even more, my need to give attention to it. Adichie, a Nigerian writer and teacher of writing, by the way, insightfully points up the need for a balance of stories given the danger of one single story. The need is to honor the diversity of story in this world, honor a diversity of voices here at YDS, at Yale with professors and students trained in diverse academic institutions and cultures. That includes a diversity of Hispanic American stories, a diversity of African American stories, a diversity of Asian American stories, a diversity of women's stories, even if they're not seriously heard in the Senate of the US, to complement the dominant white stories in this culture. Having different voices is not a threat, but it enriches the educational landscape. Adichie notes this, quote, "Many stories matter to empower and humanize others and to repair the world." reject the single story, and regain paradise. And I would add, to honor and glorify God and the diversity of God's creation. Now, we have 4 Gospels, not just one in the New Testament canon, and Justo Gonzalez, another graduate of Yale, suggests that we also have a 5th Gospel, the book of Acts, that effectively serves as a gospel of the Spirit of Jesus. Acts records the acts of God's Spirit that found expression in the lives of the apostles that had a global impact. We discover 5 portraits of Jesus in the New Testament, and this is noteworthy. Matthew portrays Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us, the second Moses, the Messiah, and I would add, teacher. Mark portrays Jesus as the Son of Man, active in all of life. Luke portrays Jesus as the inclusive Savior of all humankind, including women, children, and Gentiles. John portrays Jesus as the Word, the Logos made flesh, the very Son of God, and his I am statements elaborate. Acts portrays Jesus as the Spirit of Jesus transformed the followers of his way and the first century world. Noteworthy implication. We need to honor diverse spiritual stories embodied in sharing testimonies, spiritual memoirs in our congregations, in our communities, and in our world. With that not being the case, we truncate God's message. A proviso is necessary, though, and it is embodied in the chapter of 2 Corinthians, read to us, and the focus of Psalm 145 that we heard this morning. Our stories need to celebrate our God and God's competence, sufficiency, grace, and love that undergirds and guides all our lives. Paul's accounts of his personal journey in Philippians 3 and Acts 22 serve to declare his confidence in the Spirit of God. All of his earthly accomplishments and distinctions are viewed as loss compared to the gains discerned in his faith. We can be bold to suggest that our spiritual memoirs can be a 6th gospel in an extra-canonical sense. As Jesus' life is extended through our lives to a beloved and broken world. Paul's letters include instruction and admonition for his hearers and for us. The connections between faith understandings and living are fleshed out in our accounts as enlivened by God's Spirit. But it's essential, especially in a place like this, to ask, why do we share our testimonies, memoirs, and stories? Why do we bother? Why write a memoir? They, in fact, can be a witness to God's grace. They can be a witness to God's gifts that bless us each day. And they can be a witness to God's greatness that we're about to sing. Great is God's faithfulness. Even in the light of our strengths and accomplishments, and in the face of our weakness, our sin, and dysfunction personally and corporately, God is still faithful, and often despite us. We share our stories not as a return to the narcissism of our time, as too often modeled in national political leadership, not as an expression of academic hubris in places like this, but as a revelation of our sufficiency and competency being of God. Our lives can be a witness to God's grace, God's gifts, and God's greatness, showed to us each day as expressions of God's steadfast love. Our diverse stories counter the dangers of a single story, about which Adichie warns us. To God be the glory through our lives, and through the stories and accounts we share. This is in fact what the Apostle Paul encouraged in his ministry, as noted in 1 Thessalonians 2:8, often noted as maybe the first New Testament letter. So deeply do we care for you, Paul writes, that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also ourselves or our lives, because you are so very dear to us. So ministry involves the sharing of our lives, along with the sharing of our wisdom. Paul says that not only ministers and teachers delight to share the gospel of God, but their lives as well. This is again affirmed as Paul shares wisdom with Timothy, one of his dear students and disciples, in 1 Timothy 4:16. As it's noted in the text, pay close attention to yourself, or take heed to yourself and your teaching. Continue in these things, for in so doing this you will save both yourself and your hearers. Sharing our teaching and our lives can be uniquely communicated through our spiritual memoirs to the end that God may be glorified. For we are God's living letters to this time and to this place. At a theological seminary, why must we bother with spiritual memoirs, though, with a host of other issues and concerns to address and write about? There are multiple in our time. First, the writing of spiritual memoir follows from an incarnational theology that celebrates the connection of body and spirit, the connection of our created nature that combines the dust of our Ash Wednesday impartation and the breath of God's Spirit that enlivens and sustains us each day. Jesus is the Word who becomes flesh, celebrated in the prologue of John's Gospel. Theosis, the expression of God's character in our very lives, embraced fully in the Orthodox tradition, I would note, honors the processes of both sanctification and edification in our earthly journeys, to which we give witness through our stories and our memoirs. So there is a replication of the character of the Incarnation possible in our life journeys as they are shared and celebrated. And I think that's a key for ministry today. In fact, Ned told me that he thought this century was being noted as the century of memoir, as people are hungry to see the connection between the wisdom we share and the life that we live. Second, the writing of spiritual memoirs follows from our epistemology in life and education, where any truth, knowledge, or wisdom shared most effectively connects with our contextual and personal roots. Abraham Heschel, a spiritual kindred spirit for me, observed, "Thinking without roots will bear flowers but not fruits." Thinking without roots will bear flowers but not fruits. Roots are shared as spiritual practice, as we share how God has accompanied us on our way. I think the most effective and creative scholarship and literature has an autobiographical connection that brings passion, imagination, and reality to expression. Letter writing, though, can be a lost art in our time, given what we heard about the web from Brother Greg. But we are God's living letters, and the sharing of those letters is as crucial today as it was in the first century for passing on the faith to our generations and to future generations yet unborn. May God bless us in sharing our spiritual testimonies, stories, and memoirs, for indeed, we are God's living letters.